Well, I realize it's not quite Halloween yet, so this may be a little bit of taboo, but I want to talk a little bit about Christmas. And the reason why I want to talk about Christmas is because we already got our first Christmas catalog in the mail, so I figured it's okay, right? And I was telling my girls, man, that used to be a big deal when I was a little kid, and you get the big Sears catalog and everything in the mail, and it was like a day of rejoicing. And I know commercials have already started. And it got me kind of thinking about some of my favorite Christmas times as a little kid growing up and all the family we would visit on Christmas. And one of my favorite visits we made every year was to visit my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. And you may say, doesn't sound like a very good visit. But it was a great visit because every year they would get us 2 gifts. And the one gift they would give us every year was the Lifesaver books. You remember the Lifesaver books? And my great-grandfather, being the ever-thrifty Scotsman, I think he would get a 20-year supply of these books because the Lifesavers would be all melted and like welded together, and you'd open up the book. But it was always kind of neat to try to figure out how to get them apart every Christmas. But the other thing he would get us every year was my great-grandfather would give us a Hess truck. You remember the Hess trucks? You go to the gas station, you get them. I think they still give them. I still think you can still get them today, but they were a big deal back in the day. And so he would get us one of these. And I remember a few years ago, I was with some of my buddies and we were watching a football game. And one of the commercials for the Hess trucks came on. And I said, "Oh, the Hess trucks. I used to get them when I was a little kid from my great-grandfather." And they were like, "Really? Man, did you keep them real good? Did you keep them real nice? Because they could be worth a lot of money someday if you keep them in the original packaging and everything like that." And I'm like, "No, I played with them, And they were indignant with me. They were like, "How could you do that? Don't you know how much those things could be worth today if you would have just kept them?" And they thought I was crazy. But what they didn't understand is that when I got that gift, and when my great-grandfather gave me that gift, he didn't give it to me to keep it on some shelf in its original packaging. He gave it to me to use and to play with. And let me tell you, we played with them, man. We would push those things all around the house and things, and then we would play interstate gridlock. Did you ever play that? You put lighter fluid on the Hess truck, catch it on fire, and smash all your Matchbox cars into them. Nobody else ever did that? Oh man, it was great. So my Hess trucks didn't usually last too long, but they were awesome. And they were great to play with. You see, they were more valuable to both me and to my great-grandfather when they were being used. And this morning, as we continue our journey through Philippians, we're in Philippians chapter 2. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Philippians chapter 2. But if you remember, Paul's been speaking about having joy in all circumstances, right? And even in bad circumstances in life. And today, he speaks to us about the value and the worth of our salvation, of the gospel in us, in producing joy in life. And that joy through the gospel comes when we use it, or when we live that salvation out in our lives. In fact, it's from our passage this morning. I'm going to give you your theme sentence right now. How's that sound? You don't have to wait to the end. It's this truth that we learned from the passage this morning, is salvation is of most worth to us when our lives are shaped by it. And this is what Paul's talking about today, that salvation's at its most value when our lives are shaped. Salvation through Jesus it isn't just meant to give us eternal security. It's not meant to be kept up on a shelf or like a get-out-of-hell-free card that we keep safe in our wallet, tucked in our wallet for a rainy day. Our salvation is meant to be lived out or worked out in the sense that the gospel flows through and shapes every aspect of our life. And it affects our life. So salvation isn't just supposed to save our soul. It should shape our lives. It should shape our behavior, our mindset, and our worship. So what does this look like? Or how do we make the most from our salvation or work it out best to allow the gospel to shape us. Now remember, the gospel is the good news of Jesus, right? That he has saved us and that he has done the work for us. Well, in our passage this morning, beginning in verse 12, Paul shares how we work out the gospel, or how it's important, or how we're to do that in our lives. What we need, basically, to work out or to have the gospel shape our lives. And it begins in verse 12. If you remember, he just laid out kind of this idea of unity and what that is all about. And now he's going to share with us how then we look different because of the gospel. And looking different because of the gospel brings him great joy, and it brings God great joy. So he begins in verse 12. Let's kind of just dive in and check out what he's saying. He begins, he says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence," remember, Paul is in prison, right? So he says, "but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling." And what Paul's saying here is that to be best shaped by the gospel, we need to, first of all, be active. If you want the gospel to shape your life, if I want the gospel to shape my life, it's an active, intentional act. It's us working it out. Now, by working it out, Paul's not talking that we work for our salvation. You know, some have salvation, yet never give it a second thought. Have you ever had that? "Oh, I've been saved for years," but their life doesn't look any different. Paul's saying, no, it's not supposed to be like that. Sure, we're going to heaven, and that's good. Yet salvation through the gospel, it's meant for so much more in our lives as it transforms us. So Paul says his desire is that we work it out. And Paul isn't saying with this that we work for our salvation or we earn our salvation. He doesn't say that, right? Earn your salvation or work for your salvation. That we have to do, or even that we need to do works to keep our salvation. You see, some people believe this: oh, salvation's free, but then you need to keep it up. No, that's not how salvation works. What Paul's really talking about is he's talking about a different way of working for our salvation or working out our salvation. You see, salvation is free. It's a free gift. Scripture talks about this. That's why we know Paul isn't talking about that here, because he himself, through his other letters, talks about what salvation is about. Remember in Ephesians chapter 2, he says this. He says, "For by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is a gift of God, not a result of works." So why would Paul be saying, well, then you need to work for it? He's not saying that, right? He says it's not a result of the works so that no one can boast. You see, salvation is the completed work of Jesus for us that's given through faith by grace. It's a gift. However, just as any gift is given, it's given to be received, it's given to be used, and it's given to be applied. It's kind of like if you get a new power tool for Christmas. Do you ever want a power tool for Christmas? It's like you get a new power tool for Christmas, and you get it, and you open it up, and you go, thanks, but you never open the box, look at the instructions on how to use it, and you just kind of place it in the corner, and it just sits there. It was a free gift. You have it, but it's not doing you much good. And that's kind of what Paul's talking about. It's wasted. And so is the awesome nature of the gospel when we fail to make it active in and through our lives. So what God means for salvation is to work out into our lives and through us. Again, it's an intentional act. And here's what Paul puts it another way in his letter to the Colossian churches in chapter 2, where he says, "Therefore, as you've received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him." You get that? If you've received Jesus, well, then live your life in him. It should affect the way we live our lives. Again, so many times we have salvation and we have this and we come to church on Sunday and it doesn't make a bit of difference in the way we live our life. That's not the gospel. That's not the power of the gospel. You're not going to have a joyful life like that. You know what you're going to have? You're going to have a powerless life because you're going to sit here and say, I have this, but it doesn't work. Well, do you work it out? Well, no. It's just supposed to work. And Paul says, no, it doesn't work like that. We need to work it out. In fact, he says, we're to work it out, and it's to be done in fear and trembling. Doesn't he say that? Work out your salvation in fear and trembling. He's not talking about being afraid. He's not talking about being terrified in life and saying, I don't want to move anywhere because God's going to smite me because he's the great smiter. That's not what we talk about with fear and trembling. What he's talking about is you're going to work it out because you grasp the seriousness, the importance and the significance of our salvation. He says this is why we work it out. We work it out so we grasp the fullness of what salvation is because it's pretty important stuff. You see, God loving us at our worst speaks to our unworthiness and his great love. And that should humble us. It should say, I wouldn't love other people like that. Nobody deserves that. Yet God does that for me. The fact that we are fully forgiven, yet we're prone to still sin, it should remind us that we need God each and every day. And it should convict us to understand that the gospel is able to save and change anyone, even those that we might look down on. You see, that's what the gospel should do in our lives. It should make us in awe of God. It should make us really think about ourselves when we're looking at others. And it should convict us when we're sitting here saying, they don't deserve anything. How could they have that? They're a bad person when we think of what God does for us in the gospel. You see, that's what Paul's talking about, that we work it out with fear and trembling. And most of all, the gospel should activate our trust in God. We should live lives trusting in him. All of these things to humble us and understand the significance of salvation should lead to trust in us. Because Paul says in verse 13, for it's God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Isn't this amazing? This kind of sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? Paul says you got to work out your salvation, you got to be very active, but it's God who does all the work. Well, then why should we work it out if it's God who does all the work? Because when we work it out, it also means we're learning to trust him more. When we learn to trust him more, we understand that much more of who he is for us. And he works in us that much more. You see, when we trust him and we're active in our trust in him, it's going to trust us enough to obey him. So when he says something to us, we do what he says. When he reveals something to us that we might not agree with, we say, but it's his way. And we walk in him and we obey him. And it also trusts us, or it causes us to trust his work for us, right? It frees us. When we trust in him, it frees us from sin and shame, and it frees us to trust that we're a new creation in him, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, right? Those who are in Christ are a new creation. Behold, the old is gone, the new has come. How do we know that? How does that get applied to our life? It gets applied to our life by trusting that to be true. And it means that God works in us to save us. So we should be active in trusting him, not only with our sin and our circumstances, but also with who we are, so that we can rest in him when we don't feel like we're enough. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever blew it and you really felt like, man, I'm the worst? Sometimes I think if you look at a profile shot at me, my forehead's flat because I'm always doing this. What is wrong with me? Did you ever do that? And you're sitting here saying, everybody else seems to get this, and I keep doing the same thing. You know what trusting the gospel means? It's trusting that God still wants to work in me and still wants to love me through that, and I just need to trust him and trust what's already true about me. It's not that we're making something new of ourselves. It's that we're trusting who he's already made us to be. So that we can rest in him when we don't feel like we're enough, or when we're overwhelmed in circumstances, or when we're feeling all alone, we can trust what he says about us. And you know what that's going to do? That's going to make us stand a little straighter. It's going to make us sit there and say, you're right, I can't do it, but Christ in me can. And that's what I need in life. You see, then our life isn't dependent on circumstances, is it? It's dependent on the gospel. You know, the most joyous thing in the world is the gospel. For it does for us what we could never do for ourselves. So for these times, we're called here to be active. You want the gospel to shape your life? Be active. Be active in following God, in understanding salvation. In a little bit, we're going to be doing communion together. That's one way we're active. We're proactive in reminding ourselves about what the gospel's all about regularly. So we never get far from that. But we're called to be active, working at our salvation, so we never feel too full or too empty of ourselves. And we grasp the greatness of God in Jesus for us. Now, Paul goes on. He says, not only about being active, because no matter how active we are in working out or living out our salvation, you know what? We're still going to face situations in life where they seem too much for us. Have you ever faced a situation that seems too much for you? No matter how much you're doing, maybe you're following God and you're doing everything right, yet you still face a situation you didn't plan on, you didn't count on, you didn't want, and you're sitting here saying, this isn't fair. It's during times like these that Paul continues in verse 14. He says, do all things without grumbling and complaining. Now, Paul, you know me a little too well. Because I don't know about you, but when things like that happen, the first thing I go to is grumbling and complaining. You know, sometimes when life and even our spiritual lives aren't going the way we want, or going the way we hope or envision, maybe we fall, or maybe we fail, or we feel like we've waited too long for God to do something in our life, or maybe we see others who are doing better than us or holding us back. What do we start to do? We start to complain, and we start to say, this isn't fair. And we complain to God, and we grumble to God, and we complain and grumble to others. And we sometimes find ourselves blaming others or God. And again, we can do this with God as we wonder what he's up to, or we try to correct him or advise him. Did you ever try to advise God? God, that's not the way you need to do this. You see, the way to really make me happy would be to do this. You know, the way to really lead me according to who I am would be over here, not over there. You know, if you just gave me $1 million, man, what I could do with that. Right? And sometimes we do that with God, right? And we're complaining and we're saying, so who you are for me right now isn't enough. And we can also do this with others as we blame or criticize them who we perceive are keeping us back. And Paul urges us, instead of focusing on the negative or what's wrong, to rather trust God to work. In other words, we're best shaped by the gospel when we can not only be active, but we can also be confident. And we can be confident that God is always working and God is always faithful. You see how that is? There's a positivity to that, isn't there? Rather than saying, well, God can't work, God can't do this, I'm in a situation, it's too great, I guess this is just my lot in life, oh bother, to quote a great philosopher. Right? Okay, a couple people got that. Good. But it means that our confidence isn't in us, but it's a hope, and it's an unwavering trust in him who is always good and always faithful. Isn't that what Paul says just the chapter before this, in chapter 1, where he says, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it to the day of Christ Jesus. Oh, maybe he's building on something here, isn't he? And he says this should be what we're confident about. Not in ourselves, but in God. You see, then when we go through situations, we're not sitting there saying, I blew it, or God let me down. Rather, we're saying, but God can do this, and God will do this, and God is faithful, and no matter what happens, I know that he's got me. I always have a saying I say with my family, when we're with God, what's the worst that could happen? Right? And that's a confidence. The gospel helps us be confident that we're not only loved, but also that God is always working in and through us to shape us. So God is always wanting us to grow in Him. And this confidence in God allows us, guess what? To stand strong. To stand strong in any circumstances, in faith in Him, despite what's going on around us. And you know what Paul says about this confidence? It's going to impact others. Others are going to look to God as He shapes us. Here's how Paul says it. Look at verse 15. He says that we'll be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. We're going to stand out, among whom you shine as lights in the world. This might sound a little familiar to you, doesn't it? Remember when Jesus was in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you are the light of the world, a city on a hill. Literally, the Greek word for lights here in the world is that you are torch bearers or light bearers. Do you ever go on a hike with people and you forget your flashlight and you're in the woods at night and it's pitch black? Who do you want to be close to? The person with the flashlight, right? You want to be close to that person. Guess what? In our world that's crooked and twisted generation where people don't know what's right and what's wrong, where yesterday people were protesting saying, we don't want any king in our life. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought Jesus is our king, isn't He? Didn't we sing that today? Crown Him with many crowns, right? I thought He's there for us, right? This is our world. We live in a lost world. Guess what? Guess what Paul says? You know where we find joy in that? As the gospel goes through us, we get to lead other people to Christ. We get to shine the light. And it's not our perfection that's going to impress people, but rather our confidence in the work of Jesus. That's our best impact. And it will shine like we're lights in the world as our confidence will help us. Look at verse 16. Holding fast to the word of life. You see, that's what it's going to do. It's going to ground us in God's truth and His ways so we're unwavering. In fact, Paul notes that when he sees that and when we can do that, that's his joy. That's where his joy comes from. He says, so in the day I may be proud of you, that my labor, me pouring myself into you isn't in vain because I see that you're getting this and that you're doing this. And even as I am about to maybe die here, I can be glad and rejoice with you. You see, as we actively grasp and live out the truths of the gospel and God begins shaping us, it's going to build greater confidence in Him so that we're more positive, we're more grounded in Jesus, despite any situation we may be facing. You see, here's our greatest witness in the world, greatest witness in our world. Our greatest witness in the world as followers of Jesus is not us being perfect. Do you know that? It's not for us to be on a pedestal where everybody says, ooh, aren't they so great? I want to be perfect too. Usually what do people say when somebody's up on a pedestal trying to act like they're perfect? They say, I can't wait to poke a hole in that and show that they're not. Our greatest influence isn't in being perfect. You know what our greatest impact is going to be? Our greatest testimony is that we face the same kind of things that our neighbors and our friends and our family go through, but we face them differently. We face them with hope. We face them with confidence. We face them with saying, okay, this stinks, it hurts, but we have God and we're sticking close to Him. That's our greatest testimony in the world. Isn't the lack of problems, it's that we can go through problems with Him. And that's shaped by the gospel. And that's why Paul in Romans says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to His purpose. So we can have that confidence. And then after talking about joy in his own suffering, Paul kind of shifts and he starts talking, and in this passage, he goes one more way. And he starts talking about two of the guys who are with him. Right? One guy is a pastor, a fellow pastor with Paul named Timothy. And another guy is just a church member named Epaphras or Epaphroditus. He's a regular guy. And it's through Paul sharing these two examples we discover a final way that we're best shaped by the gospel. It's not just being active or being confident, but we also need to be inspired. Do you want to have the gospel work through you? We need examples and heroes to look to. Do you know that? We need examples of those who are out there being shaped by the gospel, so we know what it looks like, so we can point to these things. You know, there's a movie out several years ago called Enemy at the Gates. Did anybody ever see it? It's a World War II movie talking about the Battle of Stalingrad, which was horrible, right? And it's from the Russian point of view. And there's one scene where they just keep sending soldiers and they just keep getting wiped out. And it's demoralizing everyone. And Khrushchev, who's the Russian general at the time, he gathers all his leaders together and he's yelling at them and saying, you know, this is Stalingrad. This bears the name of the boss. We can't afford to lose this city. How are we going to get these men to fight? And some of his generals stand up and go, shoot all the deserters, you know, threaten people who aren't going to fight. And they're all saying all these things, right? And then there's one guy who's a commissar. And he says this, and he says, inspire them. And he's like, what are you talking about? He goes, if we want to learn to fight, we need people we can look to that are doing this, people who inspire us. We don't need examples or bad consequences. We need our heroes. And then Khrushchev gets in his face and goes, do you know any of these heroes? And he goes, I know one. And then that's where the movie all goes, and you can watch the movie and find out what happens. But it's the idea. Now you're not going to pay attention to me, but you're thinking about this movie. But anyway, but we need examples in our life. We need spiritual examples of people that are doing it, people that we can look to and say, wow, I saw them go through this, and they went through it, and now I can learn something from it. This is why we need church, isn't it? This is why we need to get together so that we can be examples for each other, so we can look to each other, so that we can be shaped. And so Paul first mentions Timothy, and he says a few things about Timothy, and I'm not going to read everything he has to say about Timothy. Timothy's his protege. He's a fellow pastor. Timothy was most likely with Paul when he planted the church in Philippi. So Timothy knows these people in Philippi, and he's with Paul now. And Paul says, you know, you should be glad and you should rejoice with me because Timothy's here. And Paul says, in fact, I hope to send Timothy ahead so that even if I never get out of this prison, you're still going to have Timothy and Timothy cares about you. Timothy cares. He's generally concerned for your welfare, he says in verse 20. And while other people seek all their own interests, Timothy seeks the interests of Jesus Christ. So he's going to continue that on. So Timothy's coming. And then he goes on, and he says, Timothy has proven worth to me. He's like a son to me, and I'm sending him to you. Wow. Talk about a pick-me-up, huh? Talk about inspiration. They're going to say, this is just as good as having Paul. And he says, so I'm sending Timothy, who's like a son, who's trusted to carry on the work of God. Then Paul says, so that's one way you can be inspired. Look at Timothy, a fellow pastor. He's just like me. But now I wanted to talk about one of yours, Epaphroditus or Epaphras. And this is meant to inspire and to strengthen the Philippian people in their faith and dedication. You see, Epaphroditus is a member of the church of Philippi. In fact, Epaphroditus was sent by the church with this offering. Remember, they took up an offering for Paul so he could live on? He was sent to go see Paul, and then he was sent to take care of Paul, or to be kind of his assistant. You know, Paul's chained up all day, and Epaphroditus is there, and he says, hey, can I go out to the market for you? Can I get anything for you? And he's running errands, and then Paul's saying, hey, can you get so-and-so for me to talk to? And Epaphroditus runs and gets that, you know. And Paul's like, you know, I just need somebody to sit with me. I'm kind of beat up right now. And Epaphroditus would sit with them. And he's saying, man, Epaphroditus is great. You see, Timothy is an example of faithful service. Epaphroditus is an example of selfless service. And then Paul goes on as he's talking about Epaphras. He says he's a fellow worker and fellow soldier. Again, Philippians would get this, right? It's a soldier city. And he's saying, so he's right there with me. And he's been longing for you all. He cares about you. And here's why he's longing for you. Because at some point, while Epaphras is either there or right before he gets there, Epaphras gets sick. And he gets so sick that he almost dies. And it's interesting. It's not like Paul goes, "You are healed," right? Paul prays too, and God brings healing to Epaphras. But it was touch and go for a while. And Epaphras is like, "I don't want the people in my church to worry about me. So I need to go back and say, I'm okay." Because it's not about me, it's about them. He's longing more for them than he is for himself. And he says, so I want to go back there. And even though I'm serving Paul and I'm a great helper to him, I want to go see him because the people in Philippi were distressed because he was ill. And Paul says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to honor this guy. I want you to honor him because he almost died for my sake. And it didn't matter to him. Boy, you want to learn selflessness? Epaphroditus. You want to have a son? Name him Epaphroditus. That would be a fun name, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that? Melissa? Epaphroditus? No? Okay. Just a shot. All right. Anyway. But he says he risked his own life to work for me. This is a source of joy. So this is Epaphras. And he says, so I urge you to follow him because he's selfless. And we need to be inspired in what selflessness looks like. And here's one of your own. So here Paul's giving two great examples of those who are living or working out their salvation through their faithful and selfless service. You know, just like the Philippian people, we need this, don't we? We need this in our own life. We need examples. So you know what that means? First, we need to be examples of this. So when we're living it out, we live it out in community. We live it out with our church family. We live it out so that we can be an example for others, but also so we can look to others as an example. One of the saddest things I hear from people is they say, oh yeah, I believe in God and I believe in Jesus, but I worship in my own way. I'm not a part of church because church is organized religion. So what? With all its flaws, guess what we are? We're a bunch of people that are growing in our relationship and growing in our salvation together. And learning to worship him better together. In fact, that's how we worship better. Not by ourselves, but together. And we do that by looking to each other as examples. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. He says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promises faithful. And let's consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. And right before that, he says, don't give up meeting together as some others are in the habit of doing. Rather, consider how we can stir up each other, how we can inspire each other. You see, the gospel is able to do more than just save us and secure eternity in heaven. The gospel shapes us as we grow and reflect the gospel in everyday life. That's where joy comes from. If our only joy is waiting for heaven, what are we doing here? I don't know about you, but if I know that's coming, I want to be there. But there's joy we can have now as we start to understand what God has truly done in us and what he wants to do through us. And that's where joy comes, as we're shaped by the gospel. And this happens when we're actively growing our understanding of the gospel and our dependence, when we confidently face all that comes at us in life, secure and grounded in God of the gospel, and we are inspired by faithful and selfless examples of those who are walking before us and with us. So remember, as you go out this week, don't let the gospel stay here. We take it with us to work, to school, to our family, to our friends, and we let the gospel work out through everything we face this week, through the highs and the lows, because salvation is of most value when our lives are shaped by it. So that's Paul's message to us today. Isn't it awesome? We serve a great God of joy. Let's pray.